Hello everyone, and welcome to my Young and the Restless official 24 channel. The moment detonated without warning, the kind of eruption that leaves scorch marks on every soul in the room, because no one, not Adam Newman least of all, was prepared for the raw violence and even rawer truth that Matt unleashed when he finally snapped, his fist flying before his words, his knuckles connecting with Adam's jaw in a sickening crack that echoed through the stunned silence, and as Adam staggered back, blood already blooming at the corner of his mouth, Matt roared the sentence that would obliterate lives, loyalties, and legacies in one breath. Connor is my son, not yours, never yours, and the shockwave of that confession hit harder than the punch itself, freezing everyone in place as years of lies, half-truths, and buried guilt came screaming to the surface, because Adam had built his entire identity around being Connor's father, clung to that bond as his last shred of redemption, and now here was Matt, eyes blazing with fury and grief, ripping it away in front of witnesses who could barely process what they'd just seen, the violence only a symptom of the torment he'd carried in silence, watching from the shadows while Adam played dad, while Connor called another man father, while the truth festered inside Matt like a wound that refused to heal, and Adam, clutching his jaw, demanded answers even as his world tilted, insisting Matt was lying, that this was some sick provocation, but Matt didn't flinch, didn't back down, instead stepping closer, daring Adam to deny it, daring him to remember the night that started it all, the night Chelsea never talked about, the night Matt's life became permanently entangled with hers and with the child who would grow up believing Adam Newman was his biological father, and as the room buzzed with disbelief, Matt laid it bare in brutal detail, how the timeline never added up, how the dates overlapped, how Chelsea's fear and confusion masked the truth, how a drunken night, a moment of vulnerability, and a decision to stay silent created a lie so powerful it reshaped Connor's destiny, and Adam's face drained of color as realization crept in, memories replaying with horrifying clarity, the moments that never quite fit, the doubts he'd buried because the truth was too devastating to face, and suddenly the punch made sense, the rage, the desperation, the years of watching another man raise his child while Matt convinced himself that silence was protection, that Connor was better off in Adam's world of wealth and influence, until it all became too much, until Adam's arrogance, his entitlement, his constant claims over Connor ignited something primal in Matt, pushing him past the point of restraint, because blood doesn't lie, DNA doesn't lie, and Matt was done letting Adam live a lie at his expense, and as whispers of a DNA test surfaced, Adam lashed out, accusing Matt of manipulation, of jealousy, of trying to destroy him, but Matt only laughed, a hollow, broken sound, revealing that the test already existed, that he'd taken it quietly months ago, tortured by the results he'd hoped would be negative, praying the science would absolve him, but it didn't, because the truth was undeniable, conclusive, merciless. Connor's DNA matched Matt's, not Adam's, and that revelation landed like a death sentence, because it didn't just strip Adam of fatherhood, it stripped him of purpose, of the one relationship that had anchored him through every betrayal and moral failure. And the irony was cruel. Adam had spent his life fighting Victor Newman, desperate to prove he deserved the Newman name, only to learn that the son he cherished didn't share his blood at all, while Matt, who had no empire, no dynasty, carried the one thing Adam wanted most in his veins, and as tempers flared, security rushed in too late to stop the damage, the emotional carnage already irreversible, Chelsea's name hung heavy in the air, her absence screaming louder than any accusation, because she was the axis of this catastrophe, the woman who had chosen silence out of fear, out of love, out of survival, and now that silence had exploded into violence, and when Chelsea finally arrived, drawn by the chaos, her face crumpled under the weight of exposure, tears streaming as she confirmed what Matt had said, her voice shaking as she admitted she'd known all along, that she'd convinced herself she was protecting Connor, protecting Adam, protecting Matt from a life of constant conflict, but all she'd really done was delay the inevitable, allowing Connor to bond with a father who wasn't his, denying Matt the right to watch his son grow, and Adam's devastation turned to fury as he realized he'd been living someone else's truth, his hands shaking as he asked the only question that mattered, did Connor know? And the answer, no, cut even deeper, because now the fallout wasn't just about bruised egos and broken trust, it was about a child whose world was about to implode, and Matt, despite his rage, faltered at that, his anger giving way to fear, because claiming Connor publicly meant shattering the boy's sense of security, ripping away the man he thought was his biological father, and stepping into a role he'd never been allowed to prepare for, and in that fragile moment, the violence seemed almost secondary to the magnitude of what lay ahead, the courtroom battles looming, the custody wars, the headlines that would feast on Newman humiliation, the whispers about Chelsea's deception, and the question of whether Adam would fight to stay Connor's father in every way that mattered, blood or not, because love doesn't vanish with a DNA result, but pride can poison even the deepest bonds, and as Adam wiped the blood from his mouth, staring at Matt with a mixture of hatred and heartbreak, he realized the punch hadn't just knocked him down physically, it had knocked him out of the life he thought he owned, while Matt stood there, fists clenched, eyes wet, knowing that the truth he'd unleashed would change Connor forever, and yet believing, with every fiber of his being, that the lie had to end, no matter how ugly the truth looked when it finally came out, because one punch had changed everything, exposed a secret years in the making, and set off a chain reaction of blood, fury, and DNA that would redefine fatherhood, loyalty, and identity, leaving no one untouched, especially the child at the center of it all, whose life was about to be rewritten by a truth that refused to stay buried any longer. The aftermath didn't settle, it metastasized, spreading through every corridor of their lives like a slow-burning fire that refused to be contained, because once the words were spoken and the blood was drawn, there was no version of reality where anyone walked away unchanged, and Adam felt it first, the crushing weight of disorientation that followed him long after the room emptied, long after Matt was escorted out, long after Chelsea's sobs faded into stunned silence, because everywhere Adam turned, he saw Connor's face, heard his laugh, remembered bedtime stories, scraped knees, whispered promises of protection. And now every memory felt contaminated by a truth he hadn't consented to, a truth that mocked him with brutal indifference, and the question that haunted him wasn't whether Matt was telling the truth, because deep down he knew, but whether fatherhood could survive a revelation this violent, this public, this devastating, and as Adam spiraled, Matt faced his own reckoning, because punching Adam hadn't brought relief, hadn't filled the years he'd lost or erased the ache of watching from afar, and when he finally sat alone, knuckles bruised, chest heaving, the rage gave way to terror, because now he wasn't just a man with a secret, he was a father stepping into a war he might not win, a war against a powerful dynasty, against a child's attachment to another man, against his own fear that Connor might reject him outright, and Chelsea, caught between them like shattered glass, realized the lie she'd told herself for years, that she could control the fallout, was the cruelest illusion of all. Because the fallout was no longer theoretical, it was breathing, bleeding, and demanding answers, and when she finally sat Connor down, hands trembling, heart splintering, she understood that this moment, more than any punch or confession, would define her forever, because she had to explain the unexplainable, had to tell her son that the man he believed was his biological father might not be, that another man existed who shared his blood, and Connor's confusion was immediate and piercing, his young mind scrambling to reconcile love with biology, loyalty with truth, and the question he asked, did Dad know? Landed like a knife, because Chelsea couldn't lie anymore, couldn't soften it, and the honesty shattered something sacred, leaving Connor withdrawn, quiet, his trust shaken not just in Adam, but in the adults who'd built his world on a foundation of silence, and Adam, desperate not to lose him, showed up anyway, refusing to be erased by science, kneeling in front of Connor and telling him the only truth that still felt solid, that being his father was the most real thing Adam had ever known. That blood didn't define the nights he stayed up during fevers or the pride he felt at every small victory, and Connor clung to that, even as doubt gnawed at him, even as Matt's name hovered like a shadow he didn't know how to face, and when Matt finally met Connor properly, not as a secret, not as a ghost, the moment was excruciatingly quiet, because there was no script for a child meeting the man who shared his DNA but not his memories, and Matt didn't demand anything, didn't stake a claim. Instead telling Connor he didn't want to replace anyone, that he just wanted the chance to know him, to be honest, and Connor's response was cautious, fragile, but not cruel, because children feel sincerity even when they don't understand the context, and that tentative connection only complicated matters further, because Adam saw it, saw the flicker of curiosity in Connor's eyes, and jealousy twisted into fear, fear into anger, because no matter how much he loved Connor, he couldn't fight biology forever, couldn't ignore the looming legal battles, the whispers about custody, the pressure from those who believed blood should always win, and as lawyers got involved and DNA results became public knowledge, the scandal exploded, dragging names through the mud, exposing Chelsea to judgment, painting Matt as both villain and victim, and Adam as a tragic figure stripped of something he believed was rightfully his. And through it all, Connor became the quiet epicenter, absorbing tension. Like a sponge, struggling at school, lashing out, asking questions no child should have to ask, like whether love could be transferred, whether he was allowed to care about two fathers without betraying either, and the adults, flawed and desperate, tried to reassure him while barely holding themselves together, and the cruel irony was that the truth, once revealed, didn't bring clarity, it brought chaos, because there was no clean resolution, no simple answer to who Connor belonged to, and when Adam finally confronted Matt again, the confrontation lacked fists but not intensity, because Adam admitted something he never thought he would, that he was terrified, not of losing control, not of public humiliation, but of waking up one day and realizing Connor no longer saw him as dad, and Matt, stripped of his earlier fury, confessed his own fear, that claiming Connor might cost him the chance to ever be loved by him, that biology alone wasn't enough to build trust, and in that uneasy exchange, something shifted, not forgiveness, not friendship, but understanding, because both men loved the same child fiercely, imperfectly, and that love, messy as it was, became the only thing tethering them to sanity, and Chelsea watched this evolution with aching hope and suffocating guilt, knowing she'd set this nightmare in motion, knowing she couldn't undo it, only navigate it, and as weeks turned into months, a fragile new normal began to form, one built on boundaries, on shared milestones, on uncomfortable conversations and reluctant compromises, but the scars remained, because Adam would always carry the bruise of that punch as a reminder that his life could be dismantled in seconds, and Matt would always remember the sound it made, the moment violence became the gateway to truth. And Connor would grow up knowing that his existence reshaped destinies, that he was born from a secret powerful enough to fracture empires and redefine family, and whether this story ended in unity or further destruction remained uncertain, because in a world ruled by ego, legacy, and bloodlines, the truth didn't set them free, it bound them together in a conflict that would echo for years, a reminder that some revelations don't just change everything once, they keep changing everything, over and over, long after the punch has faded and the truth has settled into the bones of everyone involved. The fragile balance they tried to build never truly stabilized, because secrets, once exposed, leave behind pressure fractures that can reopen at the slightest provocation, and it didn't take long before those fractures began to splinter again, starting with the legal reality that refused to stay politely in the background, because paperwork has a way of turning emotional truths into weapons, and when the court filings arrived, crisp and merciless, Adam felt the panic surge all over again, the fear that this was the beginning of being systematically erased from Connor's life, reduced to a footnote labeled non-biological parent, while Matt, despite his insistence that he didn't want to rip Connor away from anyone, was forced to confront the fact that asserting his rights meant wounding others whether he intended to or not, and Chelsea stood at the center of it all, drowning in guilt as every lawyer's question circled back to her decisions, her silence, her justifications, because no matter how much time had passed, the origin of this catastrophe always traced back to her choice to lie, and Connor sensed it, the tension, the quiet arguments behind closed doors, the way adults lowered their voices when he entered a room, and that awareness began to harden into resentment, not aimed at one person, but at the situation itself, because childhood doesn't come with a manual for navigating divided loyalties, and Connor's once easy trust fractured into caution, his questions growing sharper, his silences heavier, and Adam noticed first, because he'd always been the one Connor confided in, the one who noticed the smallest shifts, and that realization, that he was still the emotional anchor, gave Adam a flicker of hope, even as it terrified him, because emotional bonds don't always survive legal verdicts, and as the court ordered counseling sessions and evaluations, Connor was forced to articulate feelings he barely understood, explaining that Adam was dad because he always had been, that Matt was someone important but unfamiliar, and those words cut both men in different ways, Adam clinging to the validation, Matt absorbing the distance like a bruise he couldn't show, because pushing Connor would only confirm every fear the boy had about being torn apart, and yet the media circus only escalated, twisting the narrative into something grotesque. Headlines screaming about betrayal and paternity as if a child's life were nothing more than a plot twist, and Adam's last name made it impossible to escape the spotlight, because the Newmans didn't implode quietly, and Victor's shadow loomed over everything, his unspoken expectations adding pressure to Adam's already unraveling sense of self, because losing Connor biologically felt eerily similar to Adam's lifelong battle to be acknowledged as Victor's legitimate son, the symmetry cruel and relentless. And in darker moments, Adam wondered if this was some cosmic punishment, a twisted echo of generational trauma repeating itself through Connor, and that thought haunted him enough to push him toward a dangerous crossroads, because desperation breeds reckless ideas, and for the first time since the truth exploded, Adam contemplated fighting dirty, leveraging influence, resources, and connections to secure his place in Connor's life by any means necessary, but every time he looked at his son, because that word still lived in his heart, he hesitated, knowing that winning a legal battle at the cost of Connor's emotional well-being would make him the very villain he'd spent his life trying not to be, and Matt, meanwhile, wrestled with a different kind of reckoning, because stepping into fatherhood late meant confronting all the moments he'd missed, first steps, first words, first heartbreaks, and the grief of those losses manifested as quiet resolve, a determination to be present without being invasive, to show Connor consistency instead of entitlement, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, that patience began to register, because Connor noticed when Matt showed up without expectations, when he listened more than he spoke, when he didn't flinch at Connor's ambivalence, and that steadiness planted a seed, fragile but real, that maybe this man wasn't trying to replace anyone, maybe he was just trying to belong, and Chelsea watched this evolution with conflicted relief. Because while part of her ached seeing Connor open up to Matt, another part recognized that denying him that connection would be another lie, another theft of truth, and she vowed, silently, fiercely, that no matter how ugly things became, she would never again choose comfort over honesty, even if honesty burned everything to the ground, and the turning point came unexpectedly. Not in a courtroom or a confrontation, but in a moment of crisis, when Connor collapsed at school after pushing himself too hard during practice, his body overwhelmed by stress he hadn't learned to articulate, and suddenly the theoretical stakes became terrifyingly real, because fear has a way of stripping away ego, and Adam and Matt found themselves side by side in a hospital hallway, waiting, pacing, united by the same helpless terror, and when the doctor reassured them that Connor would be fine, the relief was so intense it bordered on pain. And in that moment, something fundamental shifted, because the rivalry, the resentment, the legal positioning all seemed grotesquely small compared to the reality that the boy they both loved could have been taken from them entirely, and Adam, voice-breaking, admitted what he'd been too proud to say out loud, that he couldn't imagine a life where Connor didn't call him dad, and Matt, equally raw, confessed that all he wanted was the chance to be there, not to take anything away, but to add something Connor had been denied. And that fragile truce, forged in fear and love, didn't erase the damage, but it created space for something new, something precarious and imperfect, and as Connor recovered, he noticed the change too, the way the adults around him seemed less combative, less guarded, and when he finally asked the question that had been haunting him, whether he was allowed to love both of them, the answer came without hesitation. From both men, at the same time, and that moment, simple and profound, cracked something open in Connor's chest, because permission matters, especially when a child feels responsible for adult pain, and the legal battles didn't vanish overnight, but their tone changed, shifting from zero-sum warfare to negotiation, from possession to protection, and the court, recognizing the emotional reality, crafted an arrangement that acknowledged biology without erasing history, granting Matt parental rights while preserving Adam's role as Connor's father in every way that mattered. And the ruling didn't feel like victory or defeat, it felt like compromise carved from exhaustion, and even then, the scars lingered, because trust, once broken, doesn't fully regenerate, and Chelsea would always carry the knowledge that her fear had set this chain of events in motion, and Adam would always remember the punch that shattered his certainty, and Matt would always mourn the years he lost to silence. But Connor, resilient in ways the adults could only envy, began to adapt, redefining family on his own terms, weaving a new narrative that included both men without diminishing either, and in doing so, he became the quiet catalyst for growth, forcing everyone around him to confront their worst instincts and choose something better, something harder. And the truth that once exploded like a bomb slowly transformed into something else, something less destructive, not because it was painless, but because they learned to carry it together. And even as whispers continued and judgment lingered, the core truth remained unshakable. One punch had changed everything, yes, but what came after, the choices, the restraint, the willingness to evolve, would determine whether that violence became the end of a family or the brutal beginning of a new, complicated, fiercely honest one.